here's your decision point. Are you going to do education or are you going to do recommendations? You're going to have to make a decision about that because you're going to be in one category or another. Under education, if you have unbiased and relatively complete materials that the participant can look at that you can go over with them, then you're not going to be making recommendations. You're not subject to the FINRA suitability standard, and you probably won't be subject to the prudent man standard under ERISA. There's reasons you may want to do that. Now, at first blush, somebody might say, I'm willing to make suitable recommendations. I'm willing to make prudent recommendations. Well, I think once I walk you through what's involved in a suitable recommendation under the FINRA's new perspective, you might say, geez, well, Pete, I'm not going to have to go through that with every participant, am I? The answer is probably. Although this is controversial, and there's a lot of lobbying going on right now. Under the prudent man rule, the difficulty is not so much would you make a prudent recommendation, although it involves essentially all the same issues, but it's the prohibited transaction rules. You can't make a recommendation that causes yourself to make more money. So now I've seen cases where that worked, working with an advisory firm that focuses exclusively on participants. And they charge like 100 basis points for managing participant accounts. Well, guess what they charge in an IRA? 100 basis points. So 100, 100. They make the same both places. There is no prohibited transaction. So, and I'll give you some other examples of cases where there's not, but that's the idea. If you're doing it for 50 basis points in the plan, and you do it for 50 basis points in the IRA, there's no prohibited transaction. You just have to make good recommendations. It's the differential in compensation that creates the issue. Okay. Yeah.
There's a presumption there that the service models are the same, and they're not. At least in most cases, I think most people would find you get a lot more service as an individual client than a participant because you're looking at everything. Because probably most people don't look at the holistic part of what a participant's doing. Some might, maybe there's people that are charging 100 basis points, but I don't think most people do that. And at the end of the day, you can give them all the education in the world. What are they going to do? What's your advice? I mean,
well, yeah, I'll show you in a minute how I think you can get there. But I do agree with you. I mean, I think part of FINRA probably has it better than the DOL will get it, where they say that even though there are all these factors to consider in making a recommendation in the best interest of the participants, that it's really up to the participant to decide how much weight to put on each factor. And really what you're going to be helping them do is decide how much weight to put on each factor. Does this matter to you? I mean, do you want these extra services that I can provide? This and this and this and this. And I think the average participant will want a feeling of ownership, which the IRA would give them. They'll want a feeling of advice. A good advisor, I think, will really work with them. I think there are some people who don't really work with them, and that person may not have the additional value to offer. But if you're working with somebody and providing them with, helping them with their minimum required distributions, helping them figure out how much they need to live on, what their withdrawal rates can be, how to invest their overall portfolio, not just this one part. I think all those things can add additional value, and you're entitled to charge for it. So that's part of the equation. That's part of what, except maybe in the past you did it on your own head, you assessed it, and you said, here's what I think you should do. Now you got to do that all out loud. That's the big difference. So that means you got to have a pretty good, I wouldn't call it an elevator speech because it's a little longer than that, but that kind of an idea where you need to be able to succinctly say, I think these are the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 things that are most important to most people I work with, most investors I work with. Let's talk about how important these are to you. And that's the process. And having a little checklist or even just a list that you don't check, but that you can put in that person's file, somewhat like a risk tolerance questionnaire, very much like a risk tolerance questionnaire in the sense that you walk them through it, you fill it out and you put it in the file. This would be that same thing. I think we're now creating it's a risk tolerance questionnaire for you because you're using it to minimize risk, but it's a sort of a retirement and investing questionnaire for the participant because they're looking, security. They're really looking for long-term security. And that's something I think that, certainly people in their 40s and 50s and 60s still want to go face-to-face with an advisor. They still want to ask questions and get answers. I don't know, my kids are completely electronic and they're 20s, so maybe they'll live in a different world. But for people retiring now and 10 and 15 years from now, I think they're going to want to work with an advisor. I don't know how you guys are. Every time I go to do anything on the internet, particularly with any financial service company, I assume the computer's going to blow up and it's not going to let me in. I go into it with the worst possible attitude. But I think I'm probably pretty representative of my age group, that I want somebody to make it work for me. I don't want to have to fight the system to get something done. On the other hand, my kids may not see that as a fight. That's just business as usual for them. So anyway, I do think you get there, and I do think you're exactly right on the extra services. I think that's the biggest single value. I think another one is a feeling of ownership, of having all your money in one place, convenience, ease of dealing with it. I think there are several advantages that will lead people to want to do it. I just think that's something we may have been doing casually, now needs to be done more formally. And it's great to have some paperwork in your file to support that. Okay, but keep in mind, if a participant just comes to you and says, hey, I'm leaving my company, I'm going to retire, I'm going to take my money out of the plan, roll it to an IRA, will you help me invest it? None of this applies. They've already made the decision. The key thing here is the distribution decision. That's what you have to think about. That's the key thing, the distribution decision. If you're not involved in the distribution decision, then you can take all these slides and throw them away because they don't apply to you. This is really all about, do I take my money out of the plan or leave it in the plan? There are 4 options. I mean, just real world, you could narrow that to 2 right away. Do I leave the money in the plan or do I roll it to an IRA? Because that's going to be what 90% of the people actually deal with. And 100% of the retirees, unless they have company stock in the plan. So those are the big 2. I mean, I keep talking about 4 because there are 4, and I keep talking about 4 because that's what the regulators talk about. But amongst us, 9 times out of 10, there's 2, and you're really assessing those 2 options and the pros and cons of each. And you're given, you're being a little bit of an educator, and you're teaching the participant how to think. But in the file analysis, the way I think you get to where we're talking about right now, is you start talking about, okay, let's see which of these really matter to you. Which ones really matter? And I think the answer will be pretty obvious once you decide that. Frankly, and that's not just a speech. I do think the answer becomes very obvious. And I think 9 times out of 10, the answer is to roll over. Maybe 99 times out of 100. I'm not saying it's the best answer or the worst answer. I'm just saying I think that's how people want to do business. So, yeah.
I wanted to distinguish between the distribution decision. So are we talking about soliciting distributions from participants when they terminate, we're actively calling them, versus having the participant give us a call and say, hey, I think I want to roll my money over. How do we distinguish between whether they made up their mind, or how does the DOL distinguish between they made up their mind and they're reaching out to you and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this?
That's where I think that acknowledgement form I mentioned at the beginning, that you include like with your account opening form or however you do to initiate the intake process for investors, that's where I think you want to have certain acknowledgments in there. I almost envision that as a check the box. I decided to take a distribution before I called Joe. I mean, but you did mention another scenario that I didn't mention earlier, though, which is the FINRA rules apply even if you have no relationship to the plan at all. But some guy comes to you and says, hey, I've just left my company. What do I do? Well, then we're like, oh my God, this guy is asking for a recommendation. And that would apply. The FINRA guidance would apply. Now, the DOL doesn't attempt to regulate you, so far at least, unless you already have a relationship with the plan. But the FINRA guidance is independent of any relationship to the plan. It just says if you recommend to somebody they take a distribution, even if you've never met them before in your life, even if you've never even heard of the plan, that is a securities recommendation subject to the suitability standard. Needless to say, this has the broker-dealer community in turmoil. It came out of the blue. One of the great ironies of the guidance is that it starts off by saying, this is a reminder that. And everybody goes, where'd they ever tell us this before? And they didn't. But that's, That's just that's an aside. But the fact of the matter is, you're better off if the guy comes to you and says, I'm retiring, I want to take my money out of the plan, or I've decided to take my money out of the plan. Help me invest in an IRA. And in that case, if you document it somehow in your file and then you help them do it, you're neither educating nor are you recommending. So you're pretty clean. Now, on the other hand, if he says, you'd say, well, let me sit down and talk to you about what matters to you. I mean, you could leave the money in a plan. There's all kinds of IRAs that we could put your money in. Let's talk about what matters to you. Education. And that is far and away the safer route for you. But it helps, obviously, if you have some papers that help you do it, like a little checklist of things to talk about. Sure.
This is kind of a two-parter, and you're putting a lot of focus on compliance and all that, and I think it's great. So, from the reading that I've done, I've seen that the Department of Labor is really going after plans, making sure they're compliant. There's been a lot of fees involved the last few years. My question is, to what extent have you seen the Department of Labor going after advisors, brokers of record? And two, the second part of that is, these disclosures that you're talking about, to what extent are they above and beyond the hundreds of pages of disclosures that we disseminate to our clients when we bring them on board?
Yeah, so far, the DOL investigations that we've seen have been focused either on undisclosed fees, undisclosed compensation or fees, or on getting fees above and beyond what you said you were going to get. For example, if you said, I'll do this for $1,000, but then you were also getting 12B1 fees, that kind of a thing. So far, going directly to the heart of this, there hasn't been. But keep in mind that FINRA and the SEC, it's just been in the last 6 months that they've indicated their great interest in this. So, take a couple of years for that to get ramped up. The DOL, I'm not sure why, but they really haven't tried to enforce that. What we're seeing from the DOL is they're investigating broker-dealers and RIAs, but they're focusing on where they give fiduciary advice and receive additional fees. So they're looking at the programs that the RIA or the BD has. They're not going down to the individual rep and seeing what they're doing. Now, two ways to look at that. One, that's good news for the time being. Two, their investigations of broker-dealers and RIAs are very unsophisticated right now. But they package the results of the investigations up. They send them to the Home Office, and then it'll be developed in future training programs. But I think we're talking several years away. In fact, I'm sure we're talking several years away. So I don't see anything immediately on the horizon either. So nothing now, nothing immediately on the horizon either. Long haul, 5 years from now, all bets are off. Okay. I keep mentioning that there are factors. The FINRA said you have to consider various factors, which the importance of which will depend on an investor's individual needs and circumstances. Excuse me. That's what we're talking about walking through these things with the investor, with the participant, saying what matters to you. And here they are. There are 7 factors listed in the FINRA guidance. The investment options. Maybe there's only 20 mutual funds in the plan. Maybe if they went to a brokerage account, there could be thousands of potential investments. Does that matter? Well, with the help of an advisor, that maybe there's some advisors we see will want to invest them in ETFs and develop portfolios that way. Other advisors will want to put them in index funds. Other advisors will want to use more asset classes. So it really depends on what your style is. So remember I said think about how you would manage money inside an IRA, maybe give a description of that. That becomes a factor in terms of whether or not the additional investment options are beneficial to be out of the plan rather than in the plan. Fees and expenses. There are several fees and expenses. The FINRA and the DOL and the SEC pretty much divide them into 3 categories. The expense ratios of the investments, the advisor's compensation, and the administration fees of the plan or the IRA. So it all comes down to that. Typically, the administration fees are very small by comparison to the other two. So it really comes down to the expense ratio of the investments and the fees of the advisor, a comparison of that. Not that one is bad or the other is good, but as we said, that leads to the third bullet point. What are the services? What are the services you get inside the plan versus what are the services you get outside the plan? And that, I think, is the heart of it. That's the heart of it, but that's where you need that quasi-elevator speech, because here's what you get in the plan and here's what you get outside the plan is now part of the conversation that you should go through with the investor. There's some differences in penalty-free withdrawals. They're explained. I mean, go home and Google, or back to the office and Google, FINRA Regulatory Notice 13-45. It's only 7 or 8 pages long, and all of these appear on one page, like maybe the 4th page, with a little discussion of each one. So it'll give you more detail than I'm going to give you today. But the first 3 are the big ones. The rest of them, unless you have employer stock, I think are relatively minor by comparison. The FINRA goes on to say in this guidance, each choice, meaning those 4 distribution alternatives, each choice offers advantages and disadvantages depending on desired investment options and services. And they go on, fees and expenses, withdrawal options, required minimum distributions, tax treatment, and the investor's unique financial needs and plans for retirement. So that's the discussion that FINRA is expecting you to have. The complexity of these choices may lead an investor to seek assistance from a financial advisor. And then the financial advisor needs to develop a suitable recommendation. And this, now the significance of this is what FINRA says is involved in developing a suitable recommendation. In theory, comparing all 4 alternatives, taxable distribution, current plan, new employer's plan, rollover to IRA. But as I said earlier, really the big 2 are your current plan versus a rollover IRA, and doing that kind of an analysis. For example, if you're not a key employee, you don't have to start, and you're in a plan, you don't have to start required minimum distributions at 70 and a half, where you would in an IRA, unless it's a Roth IRA. So it's all these rules, they're just rules on rules. But obviously, FINRA saying, and I would say that whatever FINRA says for financial advisors would be true for the prudence rules and the DOL for RIAs. So I think RIAs and financial advisors now, in order to help participants with distributions, have to take into account all of these, including, for example, required minimum distributions, meaning that you need to have a pretty good grasp of how they work. And then the FINRA goes on to say, excuse me, if Rule 211, or 2111, that's the suitability standard, if Rule 2111 is triggered, a registered representative must have a reasonable basis to believe that the recommendation is suitable for the customer. In other words, you have to engage in a conversation with the customer and get some information about, how long do they plan to work? Does it matter whether or not they take required minimum distributions? Or will they be retired well in advance of that and need to be pulling the money out anyway? So some discussion going on about that. Based on information, so the advisor has to make a suitable recommendation based on information about the options obtained through reasonable diligence, including taking into account factors such as tax implications, legal ramifications, differences in services, fees, and expenses. So at the very least, I think having a checklist of these, and we'll go beyond that in a second, but at the very least having a checklist of these factors and discussing them with a participant, dating, initialing, putting it in your due diligence file or your customer file, I think that would be the least you'd want to do in light of what's going on. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, both FINRA and the SEC have made this an examination priority for 2014. This is the first time, in response to your question earlier, 2014 is the first time, to my knowledge, that FINRA and the SEC have said they're going to look at it. But again, I think they're going to take the institutional approach, where they'll go to the RIA firm or the broker-dealer and look at their practices. So I think right now they're going to focus on programs more than anything. The one thing that might be helpful to you as well, if you want to Google it and get a copy, is FINRA also issued 10 tips to making a sound decision for investors. This isn't for you guys, this is for the participants. But again, if I were y'all, and if FINRA thinks this is important for participants to know this, I'd have a couple copies, and I'd give one to the participant and maybe walk them through it, see if they have any questions about it. Great evidence that you guys are doing a good job, particularly on the education side, if you take the education approach. But even then, it's good disclosure, even if you make a recommendation, because it's some evidence that you and the participant had a conversation about this, therefore that you've made a suitable recommendation.